During the last several sessions, we're trying to expound the characteristics of a yogi, a spiritually enlightened person. In a general way, we discussed the characteristics of a yogi as explained in the second chapter, where the Lord gives a list of some of the eminent characteristics of a spiritually evolved person. In the 12th chapter, there is an interesting discussion between the teacher of Gita, Lord Krishna, and the disciple Arjuna. Arjuna puts forward a very important question, important from a philosophical point of view. Before we take up the question, we have to understand, we have to keep in mind a few important things about what we normally mean by God. Now, what are the natural characteristics that we attribute to a being whom we admire most, whom we worship? Well, Vivekananda makes an interesting remark in one of his lectures. If a bull thinks about a god, it will be a very mighty big bull, strong and powerful. If an elephant could think of a god, it will be a very powerful big elephant. And now what will be the natural characteristics of a god whom a human being can conceive of? All the characteristics that he himself or herself wants to possess, he will attribute on God. That's his understanding of God. A God who is rich, so he can provide you heaven and comforts, answer your prayers if you ask for money, status, anything. A God who is all merciful because you want mercy. A God who is beautiful to look at, powerful, with all the qualities and characteristics that we would like to possess, but may not possess enough. So all these we attribute on our ideal person, idealization of our own desirable characteristics. Now, in the evolution of Godhead, there are 6 stages based on the concept of God found in the most ancient religious philosophical work, the Rigveda Samhita. Max Muller and Duisen, these 2 great German Indologists, have given a list of 6 stages in the evolution of Godhead. The first stage is pantheism. You equate nature with God. The whole nature, phenomenal nature, empirical world is itself God. Then you think of a divine, inherent, celestial, supernatural being behind this natural phenomena, which is called polytheism. And then pantheism, which conceives of an inherent divine being in all the empirical phenomena, individually. Henotheism, and then monotheism, the idea of a God who creates this world, who is the sole creator, preserver, and who is in charge of all that we are doing, all that happens in this world. And monism, where you think of a God beyond attributes, names, forms, descriptions, and so on. Now, if you analyze the idea of God from this point, there's a gradual evolution from gross to subtle. From pantheism, where you equate nature with God, to the highest idealism, which is monism, where you think of a divine principle, immanent and omnipresent and all-pervading and transcendental, as a supreme reality. So there's an evolution from gross to subtle, from many to one, from external to internal. And at the highest level, you think of God as a divine principle, immanent in all beings. This is the highest concept of God. Now, there is another idea of God, as I explained, the immanent and the transcendental reality. The two famous verses from the Brihadaranyaka give a graphic description of this idea of God. Incidentally, these two verses represent the most celebrated descriptions of the absolute reality as a non-dualistic being, the immanent principle living in all beings, the all-pervading, the transcendental reality. Before taking up Arjuna's question, I will read this verse and try to explain. The first verse comes in the Brihadaranyaka. I should just quote this. There, the great teacher Yajnavalkya describes God, the divine principle, as the immanent reality residing everywhere. The verse is, Ye prithiviyam tishtan prithivya hantaraha yem prithvi naveda yesya prithvi shariram ye prithiviyam antaro yamayedi eshate atma andaryami amrutaha. This is the famous description. In fact, this verse continues, and in several succeeding verses, in this third chapter, the great philosopher Yajnavalkya describes that this reality inhabits the earth, it inhabits the water, it inhabits the air, it inhabits everything in this world. So it is residing in earth, but within the earth. And the earth doesn't know that. And earth is only a vehicle, a body for this supreme reality. And it controls the entire earth from within. And this reality is not just a resident within earth, it is your own inherent, immanent principle. This is Eshate Atma Antaryami Amrita. Antaryami means the immanent, the indweller, the supreme reality. In fact, this idea continues in many succeeding verses. This is one important part in the Brihadaranyaka. The idea is this. Now, the first part is, it exists in earth. Ye prithivyan tishtan, prithivya hantara. It exists in earth. Well, if you say God is one who exists on earth, then trees, mountains, valleys, rivers, oceans, everything is God. So to avoid that misunderstanding, the philosopher says it is within earth. In that case, what about coal, iron, bauxite, iron ore, gold? All these things exist within earth. This is God? No. To rule out the possibility, the philosopher says the earth is not aware of it. And it exists within earth. The earth is not aware of it. Earth is only a medium for its expression. Existing within earth, it controls everything. The idea is this. This Atman, this reality, is the inherent principle in all beings in the empirical world. In fact, the Shinto religion is an attempt to explain this idea from a different point of view. Shintoism emerged much later, at least 4,000 years after these Upanishadic verses were written, became prominent. Because it also accepts that everything in this earth, on this earth, in this world, is a spirit within. There is a spirit inherent, immanent in all beings. Now, this is one approach, which is different from the idea of God who creates his world and who sits outside. Just as a goldsmith creates a golden ornament, but you can't say the goldsmith he exists within the golden ornament. You can't say that. So, if you say that the divine reality creates his world and stands outside, then you accept there are two ontological realities: the world which God creates and God himself. But in the non-dualistic philosophy, this is not acceptable, because non-dualism accepts only one ontological reality. So the creator himself or herself exists in subtle form within the creation. In other words, the creation and creator are one reality according to non-dualistic philosophy. This is based on this principle of immanence of the God principle. Now this is one angle. There is another angle. In another famous verse, which is much more picturesque, in fact it is supposed to be one of the most beautiful literary, from a literary point of view, one of the most beautiful parts of the Vedic literature. It says, well, under the mighty rule of this imperishable, absolute, immanent principle, the sun, the moon, the oceans, the earth, all these move and exist. Which means, if you can think of a world in front of you, and if you see a sequence, there is an inherent harmonious principle behind the chaotic empirical world. Chaos at the surface, but behind the chaotic empirical phenomena, there is an intelligent principle which supervises, which creates, which guides the entire phenomena. The verse I shall just quote and then explain. Edasya aksharasya prashasane gagi suryas chandramaso vidrudo tishtadaha. Edasya aksharasya prashasane gagi dyava prithivyo vidrude tishtadaha. Edasya aksharasya prashasane gagi nimesha muhurta horatra ardhamasa. Masa rudava samvatsara idi vidrudat tishtanti. Edasya aksharasya prashasane gagi Prachyo anya nadyap sendandi swedebhyap parvadebhyap praditchika anyaha yam cha disamanuhu edasya akshadasya prashasane gargi dadatu manushyaha prasamsandi yajamanam devaha darvim pidru anyayata. I have just quoted this verse rather fast, because I have no plan to explain every word of this, but I shall drive home the idea because it is a very famous verse. Now, if somebody asks you the question, what proof is there to show that there is a God? An Epicurean or an atheist can say, whatever we see with our eyes and understand with our mind, that's the only thing that exists. That there is nothing beyond the present. There is nothing beyond the visible. We can't see anything. From a philosophical point of view, what is directly perceived and what can be inferred are the only criteria to understand anything in this world. What is beyond inference and direct perception has no existence. If somebody tells like that, you can just give one counterpoint. Don't you see an invisible sequence, an inherent invisible harmony behind the creation, behind the sequence of seasons, So here you find this verse refers to units of time, days, months, weeks, years, seasons, and so on. The principle of gravitation, the law of gravitation, the idea of the earthly pull of things within a limited sphere. And if you observe the existence of this cosmos, don't you see an invisible, inherent law, a sequence, an internal harmony behind the inexplicable chaos? This shows that there is a higher intelligence, higher principle, without which this internal harmony cannot exist, cannot be explained. It's a very famous verse. Look at the mountains, the rivers, the valleys, and then there is a reference to rains and waters. The rivers flow towards oceans. The water is absorbed by the sun, becomes clouds, and the clouds come back as rains. Again the rivers flow towards the ocean, and this cycle continues. So there is a cycle, there is a cyclic principle behind the individual existence of individual beings. Birth, life, death, and rebirth. The cycle continues. Similarly, there is an internal principle of cyclicism behind the cosmic existence, behind the existence of the cosmos. The cosmos comes into existence, and slowly the earth cools down. After Big Bang, living beings, different species emerge, and after some time, maybe after several billions and billions of years, it may again go back to its previous stage. Well, I can just quote one very famous article which I read at least 10 years back, which appeared in Scientific American. It is based on a hypothetic principle. It's based on a hypothesis. The article suppose one day the entire humanity is wiped out. The example is given, Manhattan district of New York City is given as an example. So it came in Scientific American. Perhaps you may be able to trace if you go to the old editions. The picture is given. The district of Manhattan is given there. Suppose one day the entire humanity just vanishes. What happens? After some months, the water the whole city may get flooded. And then there is a picture given after 2000 years. Weeds and grass grows where huge skyscrapers once existed. And then there is again example given after 10,000 years. Another picture. Finally, there is a picture given after a few millions of years. The whole cosmos has gone back to a subtle, abstract, inhospitable phenomenon where human beings or no species can exist. And again it may cool down. Again the earth may becomes hospitable. Human beings and other living species could again come back to existence, and human civilization may again re-emerge rather. Now, of course, this is a pure hypothesis. So you can find there is a cyclicism behind. Coming to existence is nothing but a change from subtle to gross. Going back to destruction, which means dissolution, is nothing but the gross going back to the subtle. Only to come back to the gross form, which is called creation, going back to the subtle, which is called the dissolution. So there is a cyclicism behind this. Now, Yajnavalkya is explaining the possibility of a higher supreme intelligent principle behind this cosmic existence, behind the seasons, the time principle, behind the rivers that flow towards the east, behind the rivers that flow towards the west, behind the mountains and valleys, behind the events and also the phenomenal empirical things. We do not know. Behind the time principle. So he says, Ratava Samvatsara, Masa, Ardhamasa, you find. We mean half month, full month, year, and so on. Seasons are all mentioned here. Nimesha means units of time are mentioned. So behind these phenomena, but invisible to us, but it is possible for us to experience. Yajnavalkya, the great philosopher of Upanishad, says, there is an invisible, inexplicable, but intensely felt supreme intelligence. So from this inference, you can understand the possibility of a harmonizing principle behind this chaotic, apparently disconnected empirical phenomena. That's the idea behind. Now, to understand this, you need a higher intelligence. In fact, this idea is related to non-dualism. So the question arises, is God a principle, an idea, a supreme, immanent, omnipresent reality? Or is God a being who creates this world, who sits outside the world which he creates, who supervises his creation, who protects, sustains, and ultimately dissolves the universe? Is God such a created being? These are the two fundamental ideas of God that exist. In fact, Arjuna is asking a question related to this apparently contradictory ideas of Godhead. The first verse, Evam satata yuktaye bhaktastvam pariupasade ye chapi aksharam avyaktam tesham ke yoga vittamaka. Now Arjuna is putting a simple question. Who is superior? That's the question. On the one hand, there are devotees who are very steadfast, who worship you as the creator of this world, as the manifest reality, as a God whom we can explain, to whom we attribute characteristics and qualities, a God whom we explain to be compassionate, merciful, who listens to our prayers, who protects us, to whom we can turn for help and guidance. A God who could be explained in terms of a form, a set of qualities and characteristics. A God who can define or describe, and who is explained and described in innumerable theological books. Or another set of devotees who meditate upon God, who cannot be explained, who is beyond description, who is indescribable, beyond definition, beyond words, who is immanent, as I already explained earlier. Here, Prithiviyam Tishtan, Prithiviyantaraha, Prithvi Naveda, you already explained here. A reality who exists within earth as the immanent principle. Who is superior? Arjuna, remember, Arjuna is a simple man, actually. Arjuna's position in Gita is not that of a great philosopher. In fact, in many ways, he is more confused than most of us. That's why he is asking this question. If you read the Gita, you find Arjuna in a way represents the common people who naturally may feel confused when they read books on theology and philosophy. So he is asking this question. On the one hand, there are devotees who worship you as a creator God. And there are those devotees who worship you as the immanent, omnipresent, transcendental principle, the imperishable, the unmanifested. Now, There are these two types of devotees who are better yogis, who are better versed, who are more accomplished in yoga, in yogic evolution. This is the question which Arjuna puts to Krishna. The famous part of the Gita, it comes, if those of you who may be interested, it comes in the 12th chapter, the first verse of 12th chapter. Now, in answer to this, Lord Krishna explains a few important points in spiritual life. He says, our understanding of God is not a matter of our choice. It is a matter of our evolution. It is not a thing that we can choose for ourselves. Do you want orange? You buy orange. Do you want apple? You buy apple. Like that we cannot say, I would rather meditate on a creator God. Oh no, I would rather think of God as a supreme, immanent principle. We cannot have a choice. If you try to choose, it's like a student trying to choose the class where he would like to sit. If a boy who has just studied the 5th standard, if he prefers to go to directly to MIT and to research, if that is his choice, it is not possible for him. He has to evolve to reach that status. In spiritual life also, we have to evolve. We cannot have a choice. If you choose like that, we may be closing our own progress. We may be putting an obstacle in front of our own our path, our spiritual progress. So Lord Krishna gives a very simple hint, and then we come to the central principle of Bhakti Yoga. That's what I'm going to deal with today. So first he says, if you believe that you have a body, then you have to believe this world is real. Then you cannot think of God as an indescribable, immanent principle, omnipresent principle. You cannot really practice non-dualism. You can at the most study non-dualism, but practice dualism. You have to think of God who creates this world. If you feel that we have a body, then we have to feel that the world is real, because this body is nothing but part of the empirical world. And if you believe that the world is real, then you have to believe in the reality of a God who creates this world. And if you believe in the reality of a God who creates this world, then you have to attribute creatorship to that God. And that God should have some form, certain characteristics. So, sometimes, in some religious philosophy, there is a great irony. In some religious philosophies, they think of God without form, but they attribute qualities and characteristics. But there is a logical contradiction behind this. Well, you can say air. Well, air is here. We feel the presence of air. It has no form. We can't see the air. Somebody raised this question, but then he said, well, air may have bad smell or good smell. So that smell comes not from air, from something else. The air is passing through those things which bring good or bad smell. The air by itself is totally formless and attributeless. So if you can think of God as the immanent principle, as the all-pervading reality, as beyond names and forms and attributes and creatorship, then you should also be able to deny the reality of this world, the absolute reality, of course. The world is relatively real, then you should not consider this world to be absolutely real. And you should also consider this body as only a relative reality. The moment we attribute reality to the world, then we attribute reality to our own body, then we have to think of a God who creates this world, to whom we can pray to. The moment we go beyond body consciousness, the moment we are able to deny the absolute reality of this world, then we can think of a God who goes beyond names and forms and attributes. This is the simple idea which Lord Krishna gives the subsequent verses. And then he also gives a hint, a warning. He says, those who are full of body consciousness and those who are so much worried about this world, those who consider this world to be real and their own body to be the only absolute reality, those who consider this world to be an absolute reality, if they think of a God who is unmanifest, who is attributeless, who is beyond creatorship, then there is a big problem. It will be a contradiction and it will be a stumbling block in their spiritual progress. This is the idea behind. Now, after explaining these principles, you find a 12th chapter from 8th verse to 11th verse. In 4 verses, Lord Krishna gives 4 levels of spiritual progress for those who think of God, who meditate upon God as a creator, as a compassionate being, as a being endowed with forms, attributes, and qualities. The 4 verses from 8th to 11th verse. In a descending order, it gives 4 levels of the evolution of a spiritual seeker who meditates on God, who is endowed with name, form, and creatorship. Remember, it's in descending order. The 8th verse is, Mayyeva mana atatsva mai buddhim nivesaya nivasishasi mayyeva ata udham nasamsya. This is the 8th verse. So, there, Lord Krishna says, you fix your mind on me and place your intellect in me, then you will live in me hereafter. This is a literal translation. The idea is this. Of course, this is the highest level of evolution in the life of a devotee of God. Those who believe in God as a being endowed with characteristics and qualities. I mean, a creator God, a God who creates this world, who creates so many other things for our sustenance, who listens to our prayers, who fulfills our expectations, to whom we can turn for guidance and help, whom we can worship in a place of worship, whom we can understand by reading books, religious works. Well, if that person reaches the highest peak, the highest level of devotional evolution, he will gradually understand that God doesn't live in a place of worship. In fact, the permanent residence of God is the devotee's heart. That is his permanent address. So God, but remember, this is the highest level of experience in devotional philosophy. One should not begin with this, because one very serious problem in spiritual life is we feel that we can actually have our own choice. This is one of the most serious misunderstandings in spiritual life. 99.9% of the confusions and failures in spiritual life are due to this terrible misunderstanding. We think we can have our choice without really becoming equipped or fit for that choice. In material life, in a university or in a school, we know that we have to qualify for that. But in spiritual life, we feel, often people mistake, well, I want to be that, so I can have it. Second point is, we often mistake a philosophical conviction to be our real state. That is another much more serious and much more dangerous misunderstanding. When we read a book on non-dualistic philosophy, immediately we are impressed, we are mesmerized. And then we think, well, this non-dualistic philosophy of Shankaracharya is really wonderful. Non-dualism tells you that God is beyond books, so we need not read any We not take the trouble to read any religious books or devotional hymns, nothing. And non-dualism tells you that God is present everywhere. So why should we go to a temple or a church or a synagogue? No need. And again, non-dualism tells you that God is present in all beings. In that case, everybody is the same. These are terrible misunderstandings. This is only an intellectual presentation of a grand idea, which is really not an idea, it's a really matter of inner experience. That's why I said 99.99 infinite number of nines you can put there. Percentage of failures and disasters in spiritual life is due to this terrible misunderstanding. When we read a book, when we intellectually understand an idea, immediately we believe that is a matter of my own, I have reached that state. Of course, in psychiatry, there's a problem, prophet syndrome, In many lunatic asylums, you've come across these patients. Patients who read the Bible suddenly sometimes delude themselves to think they are Jesus Christ. So you find if you go there, people, if you go, the delusion of reference, inner kind of delusion, schizophrenia, prophet syndrome. In the old psychiatric books, you find this one. This is a very serious problem. And non-dualistic philosophy, it is a very, very serious problem. I can give an example to show how serious it is. Sri Ramakrishna had many disciples. Swami Vivekananda's guru. Some of them were extremely well-educated, well-versed in Western philosophy and also in non-dualistic philosophy, Upanishadic philosophy. And in fact, one of his most prominent disciples was Mahendranath Gupta, the chronicler of Sri Ramakrishna's instructions. M is called. He is the author of Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna. He was an extremely noble-hearted man, a well-educated, well-versed in both Christian theological works, Eastern philosophy, and also Western philosophy. And he was an headmaster. In those days, only extremely well-educated people used to be appointed as his headmasters. And it was he who actually guided many of Sri Ramakrishna's monastic disciples to Sri Ramakrishna, because many of them were his students. But one day Sri Ramakrishna asked him, in fact, during the first meeting, during the early phase of his interaction with Sri Ramakrishna, do you believe in God with form or without form? He said, I would rather believe in God without form. Then Sri Ramakrishna said, well, do that, but don't think that those who believe in God with form they're inferior or they're wrong. Sri Ramakrishna gives a strong warning against any kind of fundamentalistic, lopsided, narrow-minded approach. But one important point to remember is, Sri Ramakrishna did not teach him non-dualism. This man was extremely impressed by Upanishadic philosophy of non-dualism, and he wanted to be taught non-dualism, but Sri Ramakrishna did not teach him non-dualism. He found that this man really is not fit for the practice of non-dualistic philosophy. There was no prejudice. Intellectually, he knew non-dualistic philosophy. I read many of these books. And so he thought he was ready for it. But Sri Ramakrishna understood that this man is not yet ready. So Sri Ramakrishna insisted that he should read devotional classics. There was another disciple, the world-famous Swami Vivekananda, who was an agnostic to begin with. He was a college student who came to Sri Ramakrishna. He was also well-versed in Upanishadic philosophy, Eastern and Western philosophical traditions. And he was, of course, he has studied Upanishadic philosophy of non-dualism, but he was not in a mood to accept the idea that God is present everywhere, that Brahman is the immanent, invisible, immanent principle, the all-pervading reality. He was not willing to accept that. In fact, sometimes he, in a very lighter vein, he used to say, you mean I am God, you are God, all these beings are God, how ridiculous. Sometimes he used to make fun. But Sri Ramakrishna understood that he was really fit for non-dualistic philosophy. He was fit for the practice of non-dualism. And Sri Ramakrishna persuaded him, forced him, compelled him to read the important classical works of non-dualism, like Ashtavakra Gita and other books. So, an agnostic who was not really willing, not intellectually willing to accept non-dualism, was compelled by his teacher to practice and study non-dualistic philosophy. But on the other hand, a much senior person like Mahendranath Gupta, who later became Sri Ramakrishna's disciple, one of his greatest disciples, and who was the chronicler of his teachings, who was intellectually convinced that he was the right man to practice non-dualism, was not allowed to practice it. So there is always a gap between where we stand intellectually and where we actually stand, where we actually live. We all live mostly at the mental level, at the emotional level, not at the intellectual level. So, that's why Lord Krishna made this point very clear. If you are convinced that this world is real, then you should admit that your body is real. Then the highest concept of God you can have is that of a God who creates this world, who sustains this world, who looks after this world, including all of you. That's the idea behind. So, in the 8th verse, Lord Krishna says, of course, we should remember, the description is in a descending order. First, Lord Krishna says, the highest devotee is one who fixes his mind and intellect and everything on me. And I live in him or her, and she or he lives in me. This is the status of the highest devotee, who has reached the peak of evolution in devotional life. As I said, not intellectual conviction, but real devotional life. How do we recognize where we stand? A really sincere person will find it very easy to recognize where he or she stands. But very often, a twist within our mind somehow makes us want to belong to the higher level. Nobody wants to be considered to be inferior. And there's an inherent feeling that Advaita is something wonderful and dualism is somewhat inferior. So I would rather have Advaita all the time. If you go to Trader Joe's, and if the shopkeeper offers 2 types of apples, this is not good, the other one is good. What do you want? You won't choose the inferior one. So like that, we often have an inherent feeling that we want the better one, the higher one. But there is neither higher nor lower in this matter. Where we stand, we have to begin at that point, and slowly, gradually, we have to evolve to a higher level. So, in the 8th verse, Lord Krishna is giving the position of a devotee who has reached the highest level of spiritual evolution. That's why, Mayi eva mana adhatsva mayi buddhim nivesaya. Your intellect, your mind, your intelligence, everything you fix on me. Then what happens? Then you live in me, you will live in me, and I live in you. Actually, this is nothing but non-dualism. That means at the highest experience level, devotional philosophy and non-dualism merge into one. As means, there's a difference. But when you look at it from the standpoint of the highest goal, it's the same. That's why in the works of the greatest mystics of all religious traditions, there is a connecting link. You will be surprised. Of course, we must have that outlook. We must be able to look at these different higher spiritual, mystical traditions from a very unprejudiced, objective point of view. we should be able to detach their spiritual experiences from the related theological trappings and cultural and geographical and mostly theological trappings. If we can have an objective, you find an experience of unity of God and man, I mean the seeker and the sought, is found. Some interpretation of this unity of God and the seeker, the spiritual seeker, is found in the experiences of the highest mystics in all religious traditions. In some traditions, this may not be recognized. In some traditions, this was frowned upon. In fact, those who expressed this idea were subjected to inquisition, persecution, burnt at stake, and of course they were punished in so many ways. That's the only difference. But there is no doubt that at the experience level, in the philosophy of devotion and the philosophy of knowledge, both merge into one. Now we will have about 5-6 minutes of interaction. We'll continue this subject in the next session. So if you want any interaction, if you want to ask any questions, we can. We have about 6-7 minutes left.
At the end of last week's session, you briefly mentioned worship and its association with sacrifice. Now, we hear a lot about worship, but we don't really get many explanations of worship. So, I mean, I think, we have pujas and so forth, but how are we to understand worship, and what is the essence of it?
Oh yes, you mean the regular puja. Well, in
not only puja, but
worship as a whole.
Worship of God, man.
Oh yes.
Any worship.
Yes. Now, to begin with, I mean, at the primary level, in traditional worship forms, you are trying to invoke the presence of the all-pervading divine principle on one object. It is for the concentration. In fact, one great eminent monk of Ramakrishna Order, at the beginning of 20th century, was put the same question which you put. Then his answer was very graphic. He said, water is everywhere, but if you want to drink water, you have to dig a well. If you want to take a bath, you have to dig a pond. Water is everywhere. Similarly, when we want to make spiritual progress, we need a focus. The focus could be a picture, an image, an idea. It could even be a sacred mantra, sacred name. It could even be a mental picture, depending upon our preferences. So we are invoking the presence of the all-pervading, the omnipresent divine principle on that object. So that's why many of the mantras, it's like honoring a great honorable guest to your drawing room, which you have cleaned, you have placed a seat for him to sit on, and then you offer him flowers, depending upon the spiritual culture or tradition that you belong to. Maybe in a Christian church, there is one way of honoring the presence of the divine. In a Hindu temple, there is another way. In a Sikh temple, another way. Book is invoked as the teacher. In a synagogue, different way. So, you are just invoking the presence of the all-pervading reality. In a place, on an object, it could be a divine, a sacred place. It could be a picture, a photo, or image, or a divine or a holy name that you chant in your room without any picture or anything. Any of this can be a symbol. A symbol. This is the beginning. At the highest level, you reach a stage where the worshipped and the worshipper merge into one. You finally realize that the divine being whom you worship is actually sitting within yourself. But this should not be an intellectual conviction. It's a matter of experience. And as we move from ritual to this higher inner experience, we also evolve. There is a gradual evolution of the worshipped and also the worshipper. As our understanding of God evolves from gross to subtle, from external to internal, we also spiritually evolve. This is the central idea in all kinds of worship or rituals. Even in traditions, religious traditions, where they deny the existence of an external form of worship, there is a form of worship. If you turn in one direction, from America, if you want to pray, you have to turn to the east. From India to turn to the west. Why? So even a direction also becomes a symbol. So those who, in certain denominations, in Christian denominations, they don't accept all the saints, all the external things. But actually, if there's no difference between worshipping Jesus alone and worshipping or praying to other saints and sages, because we respect and honor these great saints and sages because they practiced what Jesus taught. So there is no difference between praying to Jesus and praying to the saints, really speaking. We pray to the saints because these saints represent the central teachings of Jesus. There is no difference. So really speaking, there is no religion anywhere in the world which completely excludes any kind of external ritual or worship of the symbol. Symbol doesn't mean a visible, concrete entity. It could be an idea within that also is a symbol. But to begin with, we normally have an external, visible form of a symbol, a church or a temple or mosque. But finally, the God whom we worship in a temple or a church should be experienced within our own heart. That's the highest stage, which is explained in the eighth verse, what I explained, 8th verse of the 12th chapter of Gita. Mayyeva manatapsa. Where God lives in human beings and human beings live in God. The idea behind it. So that's the idea. Okay. So one more question if you have, otherwise we'll conclude. No questions?
If both lead to the same goal, is there a need to pursue one, dualism or non-dualism?
Yes.
Is there a need if one can see that both
Yeah.
are the same?
It's always better to begin with dualism. First of all, we should remember there is no contradiction. But, as I said earlier, most spiritual seekers believe in the reality of the world in which they are living, and also in the reality of the body in which they are living, so to speak. So, in fact, this question itself arises from one point of view. We sometimes mistake that we can begin with non-dualism. It's not possible. Because non-dualism, again, is not a philosophy. It's a spiritual state of evolution. We reach a state. It is not something that we attain. We evolve and reach that state. But that state, then if we really reach that state, then we will have no confusion. That's why I say the earlier example, when Vivekananda started practicing non-dualism, immediately he understood that is his path. But to begin with, he was a student, he was somewhat of an agnostic, a modern person, who was not willing to accept the teachings of Advaita at that stage. But the moment he stepped into it, he felt that was his path. The same thing happened to M. Mahendranath Gupta also, who was eager to practice non-dualism, had a preference for it, but Sri Ramakrishna understood that was not his path. So when he really started practicing devotion philosophy, he understood that was his path. So if all sincere spiritual seekers will get guidance from, one way or other, they will get guidance. That's true. So thank you. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti.